Good evening. Welcome to Critical Witness. And if you're on the podcast, well, whatever time it is, welcome. It's good to have you with us. We're going to be talking about Christian nationalism and critical race theory. And it's probably critical race theory that we'll end up talking more of, and you'll see why as we go through this thing. Feel free to... that noise was Dan moving his camera, hence it wasn't me. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we're just going to be talking about that. We've got Clare Williams with us, so I'll bring both Dan and Clare on the screen so you can see what he's doing with his camera. Some funny noises going on in the background there. Dan has got a new camera. We're just going to highlight that because of a very generous Patreon who donated some money so we can upgrade a little bit, which is incredibly generous. So if you'd like to support what we do and be involved in the background, give us feedback, and maybe even sit in the back of some of these chats, then do go to our Patreon page, Critical Witness, and support the work. But enough of that. We just we do this for fun, so it's not about the money. We just enjoy chatting to interesting people like Clare, who's going to talk to us about critical race theory and Christian nationalism. We've had some conversations over the last couple of months since we last chatted, and we were also going to be chatting about this last conversation, but it got derailed slightly as we talked about the Christian response to slavery in the Bible and various passages like that. So we're going to get moving. But to start us off, I didn't actually ask you to do this, Claire, but if you just give us a really quick summary of who you are, just 1 minute, and then people can go back to the last chat if they missed that one. Go for it. Who are you?
Okay, so I am Claire, and I used to be a teacher. And I grew up in a Christian home and became a Christian, and you'll hear my story in the previous podcast. But I'm really interested in sharing my faith, really passionate about evangelism, but having that evangelism undergirded by apologetics. So recently, I've noticed, and I'm sure you had, the eruption of CRT and how it's discussed, particularly in Christian circles. And my heart is really about thinking about critical race theory and Christian nationalism, all this kind of stuff, in as far as, how can we talk about it in a way that still brings about the gospel? It still enables us to share the gospel.
Awesome. And we haven't defined CRT at the moment. We will do it in a moment. When we were going to chat before, a minister condemned CRT during a parliament session. And we're just going to play that now. And I'll make sure that I've got it on the screen. Here we go.
What we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted facts. We don't do this with communism. We don't do this with socialism. We don't do it with capitalism. And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life. And it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I want to be absolutely clear. This government stands unequivocally against critical race theory. Some schools have decided to openly support the anti-capitalist Black Lives Matter group, often fully aware that they have a statutory duty to be politically impartial. Black lives do matter, of course they do. But we know that the Black Lives Matter movement, capital BLM, is political. I know this because at the height of the protest, I've been told of white Black Lives Matter protesters calling, and I'm afraid I apologize for saying this word, calling a black armed police officer guarding Downing Street a That is why we do not endorse that movement on this side of the house. It is a political movement, and what would be nice would be for members on the opposite side to condemn many of the actions that we see this political movement, instead of pretending that it is a completely wholesome anti-racist organization. There is a lot of pernicious stuff that is being pushed, and we stand against that. We do not want to see teachers teaching their white pupils about white privilege and inherited racial guilt. And let me be clear, any school which teaches these elements of critical race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposing views, is breaking the law.
So it's a bit of an advertisement, depending on your pronunciation, for the Sun there. They played the clip as a nice length. But so as we get into this, she's obviously quite damning of what CRT is. I'd be interested in your definitions, both Claire and Dan, because I think both of you have looked into this far more than I have. We have discussed it with Dr. Neil Shenvi in the past here, and I think that's still our longest chat that we've had on this channel. But I'll be interested in your definition. So, Claire, why don't you start us off first? How would you define CRT?
Okay, well, I'm going to define CRT based upon what critical race theorists tell me that it is. So for me, I've been reading some of the stuff by Derek Bell. He's considered to be one of the founders of critical race theory. Actually, in his essay, I'm going to quote in a moment, an essay called "Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory?" He actually says he's been given far too much sort of credit for the movement or for the discipline, and I don't think he even coined it that. So just to set that on the table first of all. Mm-hmm. But Derek Bell says this in the essay, and I think it's quite a provocative title: "Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory?" Because I think there's been a lot of fear about it. Absolutely. And he says, from the perspective of critical race theory, some positions have historically been oppressed, distorted, ignored, silenced, destroyed, appropriated, commodified, and marginalized, and all of this not accidentally. And so, based on what he has to say about critical race theory and what it does, I would say that he's saying critical race theory is about, I don't want to say empowering, but giving voice to positions which have been oppressed, distorted, ignored, etc., those things there. So giving voice to people and groups who have been marginalized. This is from Derek Bell, one of the founders, I would say, of critical race theory.
Cool. Okay, so giving voice to marginalized. Cool. I've got questions to follow up in a moment, but I'd be interested to hear what Dan's definition is, and then I'll kind of put mine on the table as to how I understand it in a minute as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have my own definition. Like I've read things that I've tried to understand, and as I was saying, previously, I find the whole area of scholarship related to critical theory, more generally, and critical race theory as well, as quite complex. It's quite difficult for someone outside to step in and try and understand the language. They have their own in-group language, and that's quite common in the social sciences. They sort of keep themselves to themselves. But obviously, the activists have kind of weaponized that scholarship in a way. I don't mean weaponized as in that sounds negative, but they've applied it and sort of applied critical race theory to the to their activism. But the way I kind of understand it is it's kind of the view. Critical race theory, again, Claire, get me right, kind of arose from a legal perspective, a way of trying to understand racial disparities in law and legislation. And essentially, they were proposing that law and legislation were inherently racist, and another key tenet would be that race, rather than being biological, is a social construct created by white people to kind of further and enhance their interests. So the law and legislation is set up in a way to benefit white people and to and have its opposite effect on people of color, etc. And that its racial equality emerges from that. You get sort of social, economic, and legal disparities in sentences and things like that on account of white people creating those structures, leading to them benefiting from those systems at the expense of people of color, and that's why we end up with these big disparities between certain racial groups in terms of poverty, of criminality, and things like that. And that's that would be a rough summary. There's more I could say, but that's kind of what I've taken from it, and what that means in practice, and what I mean when I use the term weaponized. I think when it's been that scholarship has been applied, what it amounts to, and I think what a lot of people have concerns about from the activist perspective, is that if you live and interact through that lens, it has the effect of racial. Every interaction is you interpret every social interaction, event, celebration, like everything through a racialized lens, where you presume that racism is always present, and so you ask a very different question. So you don't start off by asking, was that racist? It's how was it racist? And I think I have concerns about how helpful that is, whether that's even true empirically. I'm not even sure if it's falsifiable, etc. But that would be sort of some of my concerns. And I've got absolutely. Recently, I was a co-author in a paper in the American Journal of Bioethics, actually arguing for that actually black people should be, or any people of color should actually, who have been given longer sentences, especially for sort of drug offences, should be released. I think it's incredibly harmful to lock up people, and this is and these drug offences, possession, things like that, do predominantly affect African American communities and Hispanic and things like that, and that's absolutely socially harmful to remove. Who are usually men, removing dads from men from the communities, from their families. It's horrendous injustice, and it's so I'm absolutely against racism, how I understand it, in terms of discrimination against people on the basis of skin color. But I am uncomfortable with taking that critical race approach to social interactions, and I really can't see that. For me, like, I genuinely think it's going to be more. I think it will cause much more harm than good, and I could be wrong, but that's just the way I've kind of understood it.
So just to lay my cards on the table and my understanding of it as well, as I'm kind of on the fence, because there are some criticisms of critical race theory that I see are legitimate, but there's also seeing it as a framework to help us identify who's been marginalized, how they've been marginalized, and working to, as you said, Claire, give a voice to those who have been marginalized. It does seem like there's a lot of conversation around power, who holds the power, who defines terms, and part of the reason I'm on the fence about it is because I see it used, the other side, let's say, uses it as a weapon. Potentially, if we're talking about racial sides, white people tend to use it as a label on people that are concerned about racial inequalities and justice. And I think an example of that was, I was listening to, I think it was Razul Berry's conversation with Neil Shenvi on Unbelievable, and he came across CRT when it was a label used against him, in the sense of being a cultural Marxist. He was aware, this is around the time of George Floyd, he dug into the civil rights history, building off, in his words, building off people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth, that's the one, and the whole history of civil rights. And he was labelled CRT, or cultural Marxist. He then dug into it and started really reading around what this label he was being given. And his argument was, there's stuff I can pull out of it, but there's also stuff that we can discard. And so I kind of see it in that way. Potentially there's stuff that we can pull out, there's stuff we can discard, and that the stuff that Dan was mentioning is some of the stuff that I'm aware that if we have our lens is race, we will see everything as racial, and that can cause severe issues. But one thing that stood out to me from that conversation was Russell. He mentioned that oftentimes people throw this critical race theory as a label on people, and they don't actually have, they have an uncritical race theory. They don't interact with the racial inequalities. They don't see that the black community is still reeling from the stuff that's happened in the States around George Floyd. But even recently, a 10-year-old girl was pepper sprayed in the face by police, and you've got that going on, and then the retaliation of people that are against CRT, instead of going, this is horrific, let's reform the police, let's look at what's going on here, they go, oh, you're just social justice warriors, you're CRT, and so it becomes this label of fear that builds off the historic inequalities of, like, Martin Luther King being called a communist. Like, it goes back this, let's label those who are worried about social inequality, and let's talk about the meaning of words without dealing with the injustice. So that's kind of why I'm on the fence, because I don't want to, I can see that in the past these kind of labels have been used, and I think you've used an interesting word there, weaponized, against black people, going, hey, we're hurting here. And I'm very wary of jumping to that, because I've got some concerns that what they're saying might make me uncomfortable. So that's kind of where I'm at, and hopefully that kind of clarifies the position in that conversation. Hopefully that's kind of helpful. So kind of moving on from that, I mean, Claire, what are your thoughts when we see someone like that? And Trump did similar, because this was around the same time Trump was like, we're getting rid of CRT from all our government stuff. What's your response to that? Do you think it's a legitimate move? Do you think government should be worried about CRT infiltrating our schools and our government programs? Is that a legitimate concern to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start with raising one point first before I answer that question.
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
I do think that your everyday black person who is not a critical race theorist can quite well articulate some of the systemic issues that critical race theory talks about. And so I kind of agree with what Rasul Berry was raising in his discussion with Dr. Neil Shevney, that he says this beautiful phrase, and it's just etched in my memory. Rasul Berry says, when black people, or even within Christian circles, your black brothers and sisters are bringing an ethical problem to do with race, we are then met with an epistemological problem. That's the comeback that we have. And it's like, really? And so you kind of have to do all of this work in advance to define your terms, to state your position before you can then get to the hard work of confronting racism. But, you know, before you said that Russell said in the interview that before he could get to when he was trying to talk about racism, he was then given this label cultural Marxist, and then he had to go and do all this research into critical race theory and then be able to have a seat at the table to have discussion. When actually he knew, like most black people know, and I'm not here to talk on behalf of all black people, but many black people can articulate in their own way a lot of what critical race theorists say. And so I do think that there is an issue, there is this kind of barrier that goes up when racism is put on the table. And there's a lot of work that black people who may be suffering in different ways have to do before they can have a voice. So I think that's quite an important point to make there. And I've got some other things to say about that, but I'll go to Kemi's speech. Well, I think I can agree so far insofar as I used to be a teacher for 10 years, and there is a professional manner that you must have, you know. So I am a Christian, and in the classroom I couldn't bring my, and I wouldn't do that, bring my religious beliefs to the fore. Maybe if I was teaching something like Macbeth, there's lots of sort of Christian references in there, and sometimes that's helpful for the kids to know so they can analyze it in their exam. Very different to sort of proselytizing, okay? So I understand Kemi's point about this professional neutral position that we're supposed to have as teachers and practitioners in the classroom. However, it's interesting that Kemi's very wary of this sort of victim, oppressed, oppressor sort of paradigm that is inherent within critical race theory, and she does reject it. But perhaps a critical race theorist would argue that her rallying of the government against critical race theory is precisely what an institution would do in its perpetuating oppression. Okay, so I just think there's some ironies at work in what she's actually doing, and interestingly enough, in Derek Bell's essay, he talks about I think a guy called Randall Kennedy, who has been a very outspoken critic of critical race theory, a Black scholar, and in the essay, let me see if I can find it. I hope I don't come off camera, but I'm just going to try. I'm good. Okay, let me just see if I can find it. So Derek Bell says of the criticism that Randall Kennedy, I think it's Randall Kennedy gives. He says, when a Black scholar at a prominent law school tells anyone who will listen that other folks of color are deluded about being excluded on the basis of their race, when a Black scholar says these things, all who rarely listen to scholars of color sit up and take notice and take notes. And so there is this irony that because Kemi has said it as a woman of color, as a Black woman, therefore it gives her position more clout because she's condemning something that is kind of being said to advocate some of the things that critical race theorists are saying about Black people's suffering. So there's all these kind of ironies and things that work behind this, which I'm not comfortable with, to be honest. And then there's this whole notion of respectability, the idea that as a Black person, you kind of behave yourself and you play by the rules and you pull yourself up by your bootstraps because that's the way it's done, and then you might be listened to. There's all that kind of politics going on in the background of this. And as I said, I can 100% agree with the professional manner in which if a lesson was being taught about critical race theory, you need to show all sides, okay? However, I do think that there is an irony in the fact that a critical race theorist would say, well, surely this is what an institution would do.
Yeah. And there must be an argument that it's a theory at play and at work in our society that it would, if it's such an influence, then it should be looked at and discussed, just like we would discuss the issues around Nazism rising up and the inherent white race. That whole thing is discussed in history. Surely looking at critical theory from an educational perspective, there is an argument for that rather than suppressing it as this.
Yeah, but you have to get it right, don't you? So you've got to, like I think what Claire's saying is you can teach about something, or you can teach that you can teach that. Right. And I think a lot of people will have issue with, because I think a lot of people that bring it in tend to be themselves activists in some way, and so they often find it difficult to present things objectively because they think they are true. And so rather than just telling students about white privilege, critical race, sort of concepts of inherited whiteness and power structures and things like that, you end up teaching them as if they're fact. And I think I don't have any issue with children being taught about critical race theory, but I would feel very uncomfortable if they're teaching, same with capitalism or something like that, and socialism. A teacher's role is to teach about those things. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? What's its history? But you would teach those things, but you wouldn't. I wouldn't want a teacher promoting capitalism and condemning socialism. I think a teacher should be objective, and it's up for children to make their mind about on the basis of their further reading or their learning and discussions about what their conclusions are about those things. In the same with something like critical race theory is, I think, teach it, just don't teach it as if it's fact, because I don't think that's the role of a teacher. And I think she's right that they are contested. They might not be within the discipline itself, because that's the nature of a lot of social sciences, especially sort of the scholarship around critical theory and critical race theory. Is You can't, if it, I'm not sure, but you can't criticize it within the discipline. If you criticize it, so if you criticize critical race theory, you would yourself be, especially if you're a white person, it condemns in a way implicitly any criticism. And so I think because there isn't, if there's other disciplines, there's a history of scholarship of criticism and back and forth and replying to things, and without stating anything about the character of the person who's responding or engaging with those ideas. But from what I understand, that's not something that's part of the culture of critical theory, and maybe that's why people. I don't know. I just think that's why it's something that lends itself to being something taught that is true, rather than teaching students about it, which I don't think anyone really should have any problem with.
Just on that point, been wondering on that. The criticisms I'm seeing are there's very little nuance in them. They're like this, where it should just be denounced outright and just cleared out and not dealt with at all. I don't know if that's in the scholarship. I haven't engaged in that level. So I have seen that there's a label called Kafka trapping, where you are damned if you do, damned if you don't, basically, with as a white person. If I condemn CRT, I'm holding up white supremacy. If I go along with it, then I have to apologize for everything that's white. So
you have to commit to a life of anti-racism. It's the only way. There's no
apologizing every time that I see someone, and that's obviously the extremes, which is kind of why I'm bringing them up, because that's the kind of condemnation I'm seeing, is that we get rid of it all. And maybe that is upholding a particular view on the world as the view on the world, and not attacking with nuance. And I think there are people that are trying to do that, but their emphasis is on what's wrong with CRT. And I think Rasul Barry was quite interesting in that he's trying to say, look, there's all this stuff that's going on in the world that is horrendous. I want to use everything I can to defeat that. And now I'm caught up in defending all these terms rather than going, look, racism is wrong. These people are hurting. There is this concept of privilege, call it what you like, but white people aren't getting X, Y, Z, whatever it is. I don't have to worry about the color of my skin when I meet a cop. Like there's all that sort of stuff that is a privilege. And we know all these other privileges exist, whether you're good looking, whether you're whatever, you end up with certain ways people treat you because of those privileges. Well, then it becomes an extreme that you end up applying this to every white person you meet, and it becomes complex. But I wonder how either of you looked into is that really true, that there's no internal critique of this? Because all I'm seeing, at least from the outside, is that the critiques are we can't use any of it.
Yeah, I was going to say that the little bit of reading that I've done from Richard Delgado, I think he's got a book called Introduction to Critical Race Theory, something like that. And there's a bit about some of the criticisms that I think there's a chapter on the criticisms that CRT has criticisms that have been leveled at CRT, disparity between what the academics say and what happens on the ground. So kind of linking to what you were saying before, Dan, but also this idea of, okay, so you articulate the problems, and I think some of the articulation of the problem is very compelling. What is the solution? What do you expect us to do? And so it kind of, back to your point, Phil, is what CRT identifies all the disparities, racial injustice that we see in society. Are they fixed, and is someone an oppressor in perpetuity? Those kind of things. So there is some discussion that I've seen, as I said very briefly, internally, and I think social sciences, they do have, from what I've seen, because I'm doing a master's at the moment in culture, diaspora, and ethnicity, so dealing with critical theory. a lot, and there is internal criticism, but I think there, again, it just comes back down to this gap between the academy and then what happens on the ground. So I think that's an issue, but I also think in Kemi's speech there's a little bit of, like you were saying, Phil, there's this lack of nuance, okay, when CRT is criticized. And because she says here, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. And I think there is something wrong with, if someone makes a complaint, calling them, damning them with victimhood, it kind of takes away any legitimacy from the complaint. I think it's such an oversimplification of what critical race theorists are saying, and what just in everyday interactions I have as a black person and other black people have. I don't think of myself, I don't wake up in the morning and think, oh, woe is me because I'm a black person. I'm a victim. In fact, I do think many people in the black community, and I can say this as from my own experience as a black woman, have a kind of stoicism, like you carry on and you continue. I talked to you last time about my roots of black Pentecostalism, and you have black people in their 80s in ministry, in leadership positions of church, because they continue, and there is this, because of what they face, those sort of 80-year-old ministers, what they faced in the Windrush era, they've just had to continue to fight. So this idea that black people are walking around claiming victimhood, I find really problematic, because that's not what I have done in my life and what I've seen from many black people. And I think if someone is is bullied or whatever, then they are a victim. It's just become a very toxic term, and I think it's problematic. I'm not liking that. So this lack of nuance, I think, is a problem.
I think the problem is the public discourse tends to be dominated by extremes, and so we've talked about nuance as well. Big fan of nuance, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the media. It doesn't work in the public sphere very well, because it doesn't get attention, and so you end up with these extremes. So you end up, and you can see how certain views get ascribed to a group. So something like BLM, when you hear people talking about defund the police and things like that view now is attached to them as a view. And so because that is an absurd view, like that would literally be the worst thing. Like if you got rid of the police force, like we know absolutely empirically that would literally be the worst thing for those communities. The communities that you're trying to help would be the ones that suffer if you just remove the police. Crime would absolutely increase. So that would be the worst thing. That would be the worst thing you could do. But that view is attached to those, right or wrong. There might be some people that think that, but actually a lot of people who are concerned about racism have a more nuanced view. They want to see less racist, murders from police. Less profiling. Those kinds of things. They want to see fairer policing. And then you've got the other people who are like, we just support the police, whatever they do. And so that's how certain people view themselves as well. And I'm sure people, BLM people who would more on the far left who have their own sort of stereotypical views about what right-wing people think. And these two extremes, and it seems like what she's saying when she's attacking those views is she's attacking a view that some people hold, but it's probably not the majority view. As you said, like you don't know any black people who think of themselves as victims and wake up and say, oh, woe is me. Again, there might be some people that think like that, but for me, that has to be the exception and not the rule. And so it's not very helpful when she says things like that, because she's not who she's speaking to. She's speaking to her own in-group. She's not speaking to she's speaking to people who
all the people going, oh yeah,
all agreeing with her, yeah, we're for that. Well, why? And that's not really helpful. She's speaking, she's preaching to the choir. She's not going to persuade anyone who actually thinks there's some validity in critical race theory and those kinds of views. So it just, I don't know, it just seemed like sort of backslapping
I think
within the in-group.
you're right. And one of the comments here kind of points it out. There's an aspect that I want to sort of raise attention to on this, because there may be some people that claim victimhood and all that, but I don't think that's necessarily to do with race. But there's also people that will jump on this video now and have jumped on it and gone, see, look, a black person agrees with me that all this is wrong. And I think you pointed it out, Claire, that's what happens, is it reinforces. And I know people go to Thomas Sowell online, and it's let's find a black person.
No interest in Thomas Sowell as a black scholar before May 2020. No interest at all. No interest in Kemi. No interest in Sean King. No interest in anyone who was saying anything that seems quite. And it's just it. And I do think, and I'll say this, and I talk about this on a podcast I'm doing with some friends of mine. I will ask this as a question: is there an unconscious barrier or an unconscious racism or reflex that happens when we encounter a scholarship, a discipline which is primarily about, for, written by ethnic minorities, which on the basis of that kind of decenters what we would normally know as classical knowledge or knowledge predominantly by white scholars, and you're confronted with this scholarship that you have to go and read, that you have to go and study or listen to some extreme views and then just say, haha, I know it all, and therefore I'll dismiss it. It's this body of knowledge which you are no longer an expert in, and I've said that of myself. I had to go and do research, and then it's like, is there some feeling of loss of like, this isn't the way that scholarship is done, this isn't, so I'm no longer the expert. And I think that's quite an unsettling thing, because I feel sometimes that's what I'm seeing when people engage with this kind of discussion online. Oh, it's just nonsense, it's just this and it's just that. Have you actually given it the time of day? And is your reason for not giving it the time of day because it's not about you? And what it says is going to be challenging and confronting. And I think there is possibly an unconscious reflex to kind of panic and go, well, this must be nonsense. And I think we would do well to ponder that question.
Yeah, just quickly on Thomas Sowell, I will say in defense of some people's love of Thomas Sowell, I've been a fan of Thomas Sowell's for years. And I know a lot of conservative thinkers, but then the thing about Thomas Sowell is he's been doing this stuff since the 60s, and he's been a darling of the American right for 50 years. And if you look back, he watch some of these videos from the 1960s, and you see him dealing with the these sorts of early views as they were developing, engaging with a lot of feminists as well, like radical feminists and stuff like that. It is interesting. He's still going strong. I do like reading him. Actually, I'll be honest, I didn't know he was black for quite a while. Just in my opinion, I didn't know he was black for a while until I watched his videos. Again, I didn't know he was white. I didn't think he was white. I just didn't know he was black. I didn't know. I just read the book. But I think you're probably right in regards to sort of fear around engaging with topics that are unknown. I think there's something, I don't know what it is, like there is a sense in where a lot of the new disciplines are they are in a sense, they come across, and again, I'm not sure if it's fair, but they come across sometimes as activist disciplines. So they're trying to promote something. So if you look at things like gender studies, women's studies, black studies, I can think of other sort of disciplines like that. The purpose of the scholarship is. And they're honest in this, it's not neutral. They're not a neutral discipline. They have certain presuppositions that they are promoting and want to change. If you look at queer theory and things like that, they want a queer culture. They want to get rid of binaries, of any kind of binary thinking. They want to, and that's why we talk about queering theology. You talk about queering history, queering geography. they have these assumptions. So it's not like it's not like the sciences, the hard sciences, although they will have their own assumptions as well, but they don't come across as activist disciplines. They're trying to change culture and change people's minds, and they have certain assumptions that are not self-evident. And I think that is something that, again, from an outside, I don't know a lot about anything. I know a little bit about some of those disciplines, but they are and they're utilized by activists as well. So when we start looking about feminists will draw from women's studies, and gender activists will draw from gender studies, and disability activists will draw from disability studies and critical disability studies and things like that. So there is something different about them compared to how we classically conceive of scholarship. I think, again, I might be wrong, but that's my sort of interpretation of it. And I think it's self-evident in a way that they are approaching the pursuit of truth in a way that, again, it's and this might be, they're attacking in so many ways Western assumptions, and I don't mean Western in white. I mean traditional Western Enlightenment values. I know the majority of people were its origins is rooted in people who are light skinned, etc. But they are not things like the scientific method, rationalism, things like that. These are things that they will actively say that they are tools of colonial oppression, tools of to perpetuate white supremacy and things like that. I've seen the science called a tool of white supremacy, reason a tool of white supremacy. That there are these other ways of knowing that we can explore questions, and that might be the case. But it is a they do come across as fundamentally different disciplines and ways of doing scholarship. So I think I repeated myself quite a bit then. I apologise.
It's
fine.
Anything to say that, Claire? I mean, I'm aware that some of that, and one of the comments in the live chat starts to overlap with the other extreme of Christian nationalism, where there's this idea of our foundations are being eroded by this critical theory, and I wonder if there is a little bit of overlap there. But I think again, there's working out the extremes, because while there is good evidence of things like privilege, and some of that's just culture. I mean, you go into other parts of the world, there will be a privilege for a different group of people. And I keep an eye on West Papua because I grew up in Papua New Guinea, and West Papuans are Melanesian, Indonesians are Polynesian, Indonesians have colonized West Papua and are racist to West Papuans, and they will call them monkeys. They will basically, it's colonization in 2021 that lots of people aren't aware of and are quite happy to ignore, because Indonesia sits on the UN Security Council. So you've got this idea of cult. If you've got a majority culture, you're going to have the majority assumptions in that culture, and oftentimes the minorities will suffer because the majority do the thing without having their assumptions challenged. And so what we're finding in the West, where there's an element, and maybe I'm speaking beyond my expertise, but there's this element of Christian principles that have allowed for the tolerance of different beliefs and systems, which isn't happening in Indonesia for different religious reasons. You've got this sort of tolerance of, well, let's let the minorities speak, and we've I'm not saying that we're fully Christian. There's a lot of evidence, and I put it in the comments with talking about our foundations are Christian. Sure, some of our values are, but you've also got the irony of, like, America built on the inalienable rights of freedom and liberty, while those people who wrote those documents held onto slaves and thought those people weren't legitimate human beings. So there are Christian values that are foundational to our societies about tolerance and things that have gradually, really, unfortunately, slowly allowed minorities to speak. And it's been generally the minorities that have fought for that freedom for minorities to speak. But we're getting to this point where the minorities do have a bigger voice and are rightly wanting equality and to challenge the status quo of the majority. And that becomes this clash of values, which are our Christian values. Which of them are Christian? Is it the fact I have rational thought, I think in this way, I've read the Bible this way, I'm a Christian, I worship this way, I sing this way, I dress this way? Those often are brought into Christianity, and that's the gospel. I've seen that in Papua New Guinea, where you're in tropical heat and everyone's wearing Western suits. What's going on? Well, it's because that's how they were taught to dress by the white missionary as they went into Papua New Guinea. So you've got what I'm saying is it's really complex, but in the West, we've got this idea of this is Christianity, this is Christian values, and it looks like this. And generally what it looks like is white. And then we've got critical theory coming along saying, no, that's oppressing, that's power, that's not Christianity. I'm using this framework to analyze your Christianity. It comes along with language like white privilege, deconstruction, decolonization. These are all pretty strong, loaded terms. Those things need to be critiqued because the gospel is for all nations. But the people in the West have got so caught up with what the gospel looks like. When they're critiqued, they go, this isn't Christianity, it's communism. So that's kind of the stuff
it's not just Christians who say that, though.
No, it's not.
So you don't have to be a Christian to have concerns with. No, we're not. The UK is not a majority Christian country in any way.
No,
I guess less than 5%.
Blended the two there, and I'm not saying you have to be Christian to critique critical race theory, but I'm saying that the majority in Christianity is in the UK at this point in time. The majority churches are generally white, or at least the Church of England is, which has some of the say. So I blended two things into one. So I think what's happening in the church is an outworking of what's happening in wider society when we hear things like CRT and people critiquing it.
Again, I'm going to push back because I think even making sweeping assumptions about the church, most people have a lot of similar concerns. They're not. You can't take comments from the odd person on Facebook and what someone says in your social media sphere and ascribe that as some sort of majority view. I think nearly every Christian I meet, black or white, is concerned about racism. I mean, the odd ones that usually tend to be older men, usually, or older people. But largely, everyone seems concerned about racism and what they can do within the church. Again, you always find horrible examples, but I don't know. I don't. Maybe just quick. I
would say, yeah. I think everyone, when you ask anyone, are they concerned about racism? They're likely to say yes. I don't think anyone would be in their right mind to say no. But when race is challenged using a framework that we aren't comfortable with, we go, hold
that's
up.
Because it's false. Why would you feel comfortable around something that's false?
But is the whole thing false? And I think that's the conversation.
Yeah.
That
I don't think the whole thing's. Go on, Claire, you go.
Yeah, and this is my issue. Okay, so from what I've generally seen is that most people and most Christians would, as you said, Dan, say that they are concerned about racism, but be less willing to discuss or accept that racism expresses itself in different forms, and some of the forms that critical race theory espouses. So, for instance, most Christians will say that interpersonal racism, your one-on-one contact, kind of using horrible words, that kind of thing, that happens, that kind of one-to-one thing, but would have massive discomfort with thinking about systemic forms of racism or institutional racism. And I understand why, because obviously Christianity is about the transforming of the human heart because of what Jesus did on the cross. And so clearly, if one person is racist to another, their heart needs to be worked on. That's what the gospel's for. But actually, as my friend on a podcast said, her name is Damilola Makinde. She's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do listen to the podcast. But she says, look, Christians should be rightly concerned with what is going on in the human heart, but it is humans create systems. It is out of the human heart that these systems are created. So the two, it's not an either or, it's a both and. And so I have found that when I give examples of institutional or systemic racism based upon empirical data, okay, so this is not me theorizing, this is not me taking Delgado's work, and this is me using statistical data, often the response is, well, it could be because of this, or it could be because of that, or it could be because of that. But in every category, Black people, and I'm not speaking on behalf of other ethnic minorities or all of the Black community, but in every category that I raise, Black people are consistently the ones who are suffering because of such injustice. But each time, so when I'm using my rational capacity to say, look, there's a pattern here, there's a trend here, every time I would do that, the pushback is, oh, it could be because of this, it could be because of that, it could be because of that. And that's what I think is problematic, because when I'm using the tools with which I expect to be listened to, empirical data, and I'm drawing, I think, quite intelligent conclusions, it's just this instant pushback. And I think, similar to what I was saying about our approach to critical race theory as a discipline that we might be unfamiliar with, is that pushback just this, move to incredulity, because we just can't believe that such racism existed. This is 2020. Surely not. Surely not. When actually, if we maintain that the human heart is in need of a savior, then surely, yes, such extreme forms of racism or such institutional forms of racism can still exist today. And I think that's, for me, where the conversation needs to be had. And also thinking about, and I said this at the start, and you both are lovers of apologetics, as Christians, what is it that can be redeemed from critical race theory? What is it that we can engage with before just throwing everything out? And also, when you have, and I think what's his name, Esau Macaulay talks about this in an article where he talks about kind of like the history of the African American church, and he talks about kind of like the majority of like the Black traditional church. Many people in there will say, look, guys, we're Christians, we believe the Bible, interpersonal racism happens, but also racism happens in these forms as well, systemically, institutional racism. We're not giving up biblical orthodoxy here. We're telling you there are patterns. And instead of our voices being listened to, you get the voices of, example, Randall Kennedy or Candace Owens or Kemi or Thomas Holt. Those minority group, their voices are heard. Well, look, there's a Black person who disagrees with you, so it can't be true. And it's like, hold on a second. I am your Christian sister who is telling you this stuff exists. It is real. And we would rather massage our consciences and listen to those who would tell us what we want to hear. And I find that difficult. I really do. Yeah.
I've seen that happen as well in interactions I've had online, just to sort of shut you down. Here's this person, and I know it happens for others. So I just on that, does that, Dan, with critical theory, because I said at the beginning, I'm kind of on the fence anyway, and I'm trying to pull things out that I see are true, and like the experience of white privilege, like the experience, like those terms, and even to the extent of, there is a truth that our theology has been influenced by a large proportionate amount of Europeans for a long time, while there has been a significant theologizing by Black people in Black churches, and we call it Black liberation theology and generally poo-poo it. Like there's this, how's this happened within Christianity? and how are we going to reunify the church and listen to people who are growing up on CRT? How can we find a bridge, I guess, rather than shutting down? So I'm just interested in what aspects, knowing that it's not all false, what aspects do you see as useful for the church? Given I think you've dug into it a little bit more than I have.
Well, try and find, I think always something helpful is try and find identify points of agreement. What is it that, I think someone like myself, who is largely skeptical of the main assumptions of critical race theory, or maybe not the main assumptions, but certainly their way to resolve problems, I'm very skeptical of. But I think, we agree that racism is, is a problem, and we should try and look for empirical ways of resolving those issues. So when it comes to disparities perhaps in sentences for certain crimes, maybe we need to there are ways. I've quite sort of extreme views. I think we should I'd love to see more use of machine learning and artificial intelligence and stuff when it comes to sentences, and actually remove human beings, remove people and their bias from it. And there's a lot of evidence and research looking into how machine learning and AI could be really useful at being much more objective, because it's literally blind to race and to skin color. It's the true colorblind way of addressing those things. I really like to see things like that explored, and I think both people could agree that would be a good way of addressing those issues, removing the human bias from those situations. I think would be helpful, but and trying to resolve obvious problems where they exist. I mean, again though, I'd have a caveat as well, is that one of the foundation principles as well that a lot of critical race theories have is whenever they see a disparity, the presumption is the root cause is discrimination. And I just don't think that's, I think that's, if someone actually believes that, I think that's false. I don't think that is true. I think that disparities can be a consequence of discrimination, but they aren't necessarily, that's not necessarily the case. And I give a very obvious example. If you look at just, we can't even achieve equality of outcomes in the same family. Okay, so let's look at one family. Let's say it have 4 children. Okay, so you've got the same family, the same makeup of the family, same genes, same same parents, same parenting style, and the same values. Okay, for those 3 or 4 children, and yet you could have disparate, unequal outcomes between all of those children. I know families where one, and again, this is no value judgment on what's valuable or not, but you might have in one case you can have someone who's a hairdresser, another person is a school teacher, another person is a lawyer, and another person is is out of work and never worked, not in education, on the dole. So you've got same case. They could all be white, or they could all be black or Asian, except whatever you want to choose. But we all know that's the case. Is actually it's extremely difficult, even with the same input, to get an equal output. And that's uncomfortable. That's an uncomfortable truth, because we all think that if we just give everyone the opportunity, and I think we should give everyone equal opportunities, but we're not going to get, if you think you give everyone the same opportunities, you're going to get the same outcomes, you're going to be disappointed, because that's just not going to happen. Yeah, that's some utopian creation. That's just, you're never going to get that. And if that's your goal, to get to remove all disparities, you're just going to be sorely disappointed. And I know that's, and I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm certainly not saying it's a good thing. And that we can't, sometimes disparities might be flipped, or they can certainly be reduced. But I think in a lot of cases, it's much more complex than reducing any disparity to to one particular issue. So I think, you know, in some cases, racial bias is obviously in some cases going to be proportionally the explanation of something. But I think there are often more. There's also social. You know, how likely is a particular group to have you know, two parents at home, to be married, to be in work, to be in terms of educational levels, you know, all these things. If you look at any racial group, there are differences. Average age, you know, Thomas Sowell points out the difference, that the massive disparities that there are certain groups have. If you look at their average age, is much lower or higher. So when you compare like mean income, well, when people first start working, you don't earn. If you compare a Hispanic group in the US to say Asians, well, Asians massively outperform in terms of annual income and things like that. But that's largely explained by the fact that they're on average an older group and have been in work for longer. There's all sorts of really complex things at play, and I'm just skeptical. And again, I'm absolutely clear, not saying that we shouldn't try to resolve the issues we can, but I think if the goal is always, you know, we're not going to end until we have equality of outcomes, that's just unrealistic, and we're going to be really sorely disappointed.
Claire, what do you make of that?
Okay, can you just clarify what you're saying? I don't want to say something before I have probably understood what you're saying.
Tell me what you think I'm saying, and then I can tell you.
No.
That might not go down well.
Because I think at the start you were saying, look, so to kind of a response to what I was saying about, look, when I present what I believe to be empirical data showing disparities in education outcomes, in women's mortality rates when they're going to go to hospital to give birth, in university outcomes, in use of police force, in use of arrest, so many different things. Okay, the labeling of Black children as having social, emotional, mental health compared to their white counterparts, that's disproportionately labeled upon Black Caribbean children. Okay, and it kind of smells a little bit like the label that was given to Black children in the 1970s as educationally subnormal. It's not exactly the same. They don't quite map on, but there is this sense of pathologizing of Black students. Okay, and yeah, just the different things that I could give examples of. I'm saying, look, are we willing to discuss the fact that across all of these things, Black people are suffering? Is discrimination at work here? And I think it is. Are you saying, Dan, that that's not the case, or that there are other factors that contribute?
No, I'm saying that's partially the case.
Okay.
I think there are a lot. I think there are other contributing factors. So I think that you know, trying to resolve any of those issues is tied up in all sorts of. Again, I'm going to be careful. I just basically think it's far more complex than that. I think that I think what would happen is we could try everything we could to try and remove all the biases, and I think we would definitely see a reduction in a lot of those things. In some things it might be minimal, in others it might be a radical shift in things. But if you've got you know, there are group differences, and it's not to say that there's not. Again, I'm trying to be as clear as I can. I'm not saying there are biological differences between different racial groups, because actually we have far more in common biologically with people who look different to us to people who can look very different, you know, that look very similar to us. But I think that there are I think culture, you know, we're not just a monoculture. There are certain ideas in certain groups that are unhelpful and other things that are helpful. You know, this thing, even looking at white people, there are certain, I come white working class, you know, my mum never finished school, got expelled from school. I come from a very complex, broken background. And there are certain things within that culture that are incredibly unhelpful. And that's why, you know, if you want to look at disparities, well, other than Romanis, white working class boys and girls are the lowest attaining at school, the least likely to go to university. So we've got disparities. We've got disparities there, and that would be an example of actually where you can have horrible disparity. But I don't think the explanation there is racial prejudice. Is not racial prejudice. There are other explanations for that, cultural, social factors as well that are at play there. But that is an example of I think of what can be going on in black groups, in other groups. So I'm not saying it's an issue to do with the black community, because I think all groups have cultural beliefs and assumptions that can be, as I said, unhelpful and helpful. Yeah, I'm not sure if
clarify.
I'm trying to be really careful, because I don't want people thinking I'm saying something that I'm not. I'm just trying to say that I absolutely agree that bias and whether it's conscious or unconscious prejudice does play a role in many of those things. I just don't think that is I don't think that's the sole explanation. I think if we ever try to solve any disparity with just one variable at the expense of all, that would be a terrible way to research any topic, is just to think, right, there's this one explanation that's going to solve anything, and human nature and is far more complex than that. I just think we would be disappointed.
Yeah, and I think there is room to say that this is not going to be resolved until the eschaton. Revelation, I think 7:21 talks about around the throne of God, people from all nations and tongues, worshiping God. So God doesn't erase our ethnic differences; He celebrates them. But I would say, I understand what the point that you're making, and I don't think that I'm saying that race is the only factor which causes disparities of outcomes. I'm saying that I don't think people are willing to put it on the table, and and that's my issue. And also, just to say your point about white working class, I think it's boys who are the lowest attainers in school. I also think there is room to I think it was I can't remember his name, Stephen, somebody from Oxford University. He did lots of research with black middle class parents, and they found that basically the race of these families, the race of their boys actually compounded how they were treated in school. So even though they were middle class, they were excluded from school disproportionately to their white peers, even despite their class. So I do think that, and this is something that I'm sure people will contest as well, there is something to some of the points that critical race theorist makes about intersectionality, that someone who is I would say not able-bodied, who is a woman and who is working class, may well encounter greater disadvantage or difficulty than someone who is not. So I do think sometimes race can compound other disadvantages. And I think from my experience, and as you say, our social media can just create an echo chamber, and we could just be bumping heads with the same people all the time. I have noticed an unwillingness to give credence to some of these things that I address or try to discuss.
Yeah. And I think we need to do a better job of doing that. Like, I've got no issue with that kind of. I think it's kind of self-evident that certain groups are disadvantaged in a way that other groups are not. And the problem is, it's the easy thing is identifying the issue. We can all identify that's an issue. The problem comes with the solution, I think, and I think what critical race theory has done really well is it is highlighted the problem on an international level. It's just I'm skeptical of what they're offering as a solution. Like, for me, what they're saying is the resolution feels like it's going to make things much worse, rather than actually resolving it. And that's what I find quite disappointing, because I'm like you. I want to see these issues resolved. I want to see less racial discrimination, less discrimination against women, less discrimination against people with disabilities, fewer black boys being expelled and from school, and all those kinds of things. I want that to reduce, but I don't know how. And and what they're offering solution.
So let's just
feels like
let's just clarify a little bit.
It's going to tear culture apart. It's going to tear, break, destroy relationships, destroy. I just see it. To me, it seems really destructive. Like when I start seeing, when we're sharing some tweets, we've seen people saying these massive assumptions about groups of people rather than individuals. The thing I love about liberalism is and the traditions of the West we've finally got to is seeing people as individuals, treating you, Claire, as an individual who happens to be a black woman, but you're an individual who might have radically different views to other women who are black, in the same way that Phil is a white man, but he has his own past history and views, and not the same as all white men. And to treat people, and the nature of what I understand of critical race theory is it treats people as groups. You're simply in an oppressor group or an oppressed group, and that really saddens me, because I think it's going to be horribly destructive if it, especially when we start using employing that they start making policy decisions and teaching this thing as sort of as truth at schools and telling our young people that, because it's not always misunderstood. You start teaching a little kid that because they're white, they've got white privilege, and I don't want to get all into that, but I just for me, it just I'm saddened by it, and I wish there were a more obvious way that was going to be effective to counter these things.
So just to get a bit of clarification on this, so Dan, you're talking about solutions that you see, and I'd be interested in, Claire, if you share the same idea on what critical race theory provides as a solution. So from my understanding, it does group in the sense that here's an oppressor group, or here's a system that's at play that discriminates against a particular group of people. I'm kind of confused as to what's next. What does CRT actually give a solution? I think you're right, Dan. It does point out to the problem. What I then see is a lot of people like labeling people as oppressors. But is that CRT? Like, what does CRT even in the academy, what does it provide as a solution to this? Is it everything's deconstructed? And what does that look like? Do you I'm just confused. We're talking about a solution, but what is it when we say solution? What does that look like?
This is part of my concern as a Christian and as someone who has an interest in apologetics and wants to do evangelism undergirded by apologetics, is the danger in Christians just discarding critical race theory when actually justice belongs to God. The whole moral argument, we can argue that, quite compellingly, that justice, that our objective moral standards, it emanates from God himself, okay? Mm-hmm. But when we do not engage with the conversation, when we just rubbish critical race theory, which I don't see happening, I don't see it happening to, when I see Christian apologists engaging with those who would espouse pluralism, Christian apologists engaging with those who would espouse, asking questions, is there only one way to God, suffering, all those big, apologetics questions and objections that we're faced with. But I kind of feel like when we're talking about racial injustice, and if we are talking about critical race theory, the objections are just shot down. And I'm going to explain to you some of the consequences of that. But first of all, I'll just read this a little bit here. This is again a quote from Derek Bell's essay, Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory? And he quotes Angela Harris, another scholar, and she says, CRT, this is a critical race theorist saying this, CRT's ultimate vision is redemptive, not deconstructive. Imagine sitting down, having a coffee with Angela Harris and saying, you have said your aim is redemptive. Where are the lines of engagement that we can have? There are so many as a Christian. What does redemption look like to you? Have the conversation, not just shut it down. And that's what I have an issue with. I see, I've been trained in apologetics, and behind every question is a questioner, but I don't see that same dignity given to people who advocate critical race theory, or who just have an objection to Christianity because of what they see to be racial injustice. Give you an example. Today, I received a request for some help for someone whose friend has gone to an Afrocentric religion. So kind of there's many of them, but Afrocentric religions that we're seeing today, like the shift of many Black Christians, millennials or Gen Z, moving away from Christianity into either sort of Christian syncretism with African spirituality, and this idea, I'm going back to my roots and what's been taken away from me from colonialism. I'm going back to sort of my indigenous spirituality, so that idea of syncretism, or going to a completely Afrocentric religion, let's say Nation of Islam, okay, where Blackness is at the center of almost your salvation. And that's a very crude definition, but I'm just trying to explain it quite quickly.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
It's part of the consequence of Black people's grievances, whether they're Christian, Sikh or skeptic, not being taken seriously and having to prove that, okay, I'll talk about Black Lives Matter with a lowercase BLM, not a capital one, because I'm not affiliated with it. Having to do all of that work before you can get a seat at the table to have a discussion. People are turning their backs upon Christianity and walking away from it, when all along justice belongs to God. So I think the Christian apologists, as much as they may bristle when they hear critical race theory, do some research. Where are the lines where we can say, do you know what, we actually agree here? You know, Derek Bell, I read his quote before. He said, some positions have historically been oppressed. Okay, and I know Dr. Neil Chevney, he talks about, I think in the conversation with Russell Berry, he talks about how the word oppressed has come to mean many, many things, kind of like in critical race theory itself. But I would take out my Bible and say, look, let's look at Isaiah 61. What did Jesus say he'd come to do? When Jesus reads that text in the temple, Jesus says he's come to set the captives free, let the oppressed go free. Where are the lines where I can engage with you and then and show you? But actually, for me as a Christian, when I bring the deepest questions of my heart, when I bring, my heart for justice, actually the Christian worldview has the most compelling explanation for, one, where I ground my moral outrage, two, how I can have a space to lament it, and three, why I should even bother to fight against injustice. But I really struggle to see any of that work going on. It's just a criticism and a discussion about, the philosophical foundations of critical race theory, which is, going to bring down Christianity in the West as we know it. And then we haven't even got there. Very seeming to be not much said about, Christian nationalism. And that for me is what breaks my heart, because people are turning away. And as I said, I had a request today, can I have some help with what to say to this person who's turned their back on Christianity in favor of an Afrocentric religion? Help me. This is what's happening.
There's so much in that, Claire, that I think is really, really important, and I think is really the heart of what these conversations are about, is finding the bridge, the connection with these complex topics, and working out how to challenge the church, how to challenge, and when I say the church, I'm talking about as a church leader and on an eldership team, it's working out how we engage these conversations well, without shutting them down, finding the common ground. But I think one thing that Neil Shenvi does do well is to encourage that questioning of, when I say oppression, what are you hearing? When I say redemption, what are you hearing? And working out, because the Christian idea of redemption, the Christian idea of oppression, even in nationalism, all of that, at least we'll go into Christian nationalism in a moment, but all those aspects do have grounding. I mean, justice. What does justice look like, biblically speaking? What are our hopes as Christians? New creation around the throne of God, with all nations praising, and all nations in all languages. This isn't going to be a conformed unit of one color. There's going to be difference there, and we've got to be able to celebrate that as church now. And so there's all of this beauty in the gospel that covers cultures, and unifies them, but doesn't make them blind to the difference, which then is something to explore with people. And yeah, it breaks my heart that people would leave the faith, but I can see why when you're labelled a Marxist and a cultural Marxist or whatever it is, just for bringing up the conversation of race.
Yeah.
So go on, Dan, and then we'll move on to this conversation of Christian nationalism.
No, okay, it's a really good observation, because Claire, because it's toxic, isn't it? Like someone mentions something rather than, that's what I was saying about trying to find common ground is, I think with any idea, or philosophy, you look at, what can we receive, what can we redeem, and what should we reject. And it often seems when Christians are responding to critical race theory, there's no receive or redeem. It's just reject. That's the focus. And if I was someone who thought that view had some merit, if someone's just going to attack and not listen and try and see what can be received and redeemed for what we share in common, rather than the focus being what do we disagree about, right, well, we best not talk anymore. It ends all potential for any sort of meaningful dialogue, especially, like you said, especially from apologists, like you see apologetics ministries and pages sharing stuff, and it's always critical. There's never anything positive. You think there's literally nothing redemptive from critical race theory you would come across, or nothing that Christians should receive.
And I guess, and I've said this before, but on other platforms, but I'll say this again. For me, I see the example of the Apostle Paul in the whole book of Acts, where he engages with people who think very differently to him. And there are these time signals in the text where he says, we spent 3 months here, we spent 2 years there, he spent a few days, he spent time with people, okay? And then in Acts 17, my favorite scripture at the moment, when he quotes the people's own poets, I think it's Aratus and Epimenides, and actually he says their conception of God from a literary perspective was that we are his offspring. Paul did not deconstruct their worldview. Paul did not deconstruct their conception of God. He said, actually used it in, I think it's Acts 17 verse 30. It says, being as we are his offspring, such and such and such, leading them to the gospel. And then the obvious outcome is that some people said, we'll listen to you again. Some people said, you're mad, you talk about the resurrection. And some people actually became Christians. So you've got, you've got these 3 different responses. But had he completely rubbished what they had to say, rubbished their literary heritage, there would have been none of that. No one would have become a Christian. No one would have said, let's re-engage. And I think that part of the reason we have such a difficulty with dealing with critical race theory and investing the time to engage with it is because we have this reflex. Surely not. Racism isn't that bad. People are just victims. And I think it's a bad attitude. And I think, if anyone's listening, I would appeal to you to take that to the Lord. Ask the Holy Spirit, is this happening in my heart? Is it happening in my heart? And then how can you address that? And how can you do your due diligence for critical race theory, and then seek to engage? Because if this attitude continues, honestly, as someone who attends a Black church, grew up in Black Pentecostalism, is committed to working with young Black people, not to the exclusion of anybody else, but I'm living in the Black community, and I'm seeing people leave. But then again, is the reaction going to be, is that really true? Where's your empirical data for that? Honestly, there is something about Black testimony not being believed. I'm reading this book called Gospel Haymanot. It's by Vince Bantu, and he's talking about Ethiopian Christians who were challenged by Romanized Christians, telling them that what they believe isn't accurate. And actually, they believed they had a well-grounded orthodoxy. This is from like the 15th century. This is earlier than that actually. Okay. I think I quoted Mary Prince before. Mary Prince was an enslaved Black woman. She became an abolitionist, and she in her diary she talks about how she wanted to become a Christian, and she couldn't tell her enslaver's wife. Why? Because there was this anti-conversion sentiment. Someone called Catherine Gerbner talks about this in a book called Christian Slavery. This idea that a Black woman couldn't possibly know what it means to be a Christian. And there are examples up until the present day where Black people are saying this is happening and we're not being believed. And that is extremely painful. It's a little bit like in the book of St. Luke, I think it's Luke chapter 8, the woman is there, she's hemorrhaging and she touches Jesus, and Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "How can you tell anybody touched you? We're all hustling and bustling. How can you say the coronavirus is killing Black people more or deaf minorities more? We're all suffering in the coronavirus. All of us are losing our jobs. All." But Jesus said, "No, somebody touched me." And he believed her testimony. And that's how I feel sometimes. I'm saying, look, communities are hemorrhaging in these different ways. But thank God for Jesus that he will say, "No, somebody touched me." Whereas, unfortunately, many of the times my white brothers and sisters in Christ will say, "We're all, no, it's not true. Provide us with this evidence first. State your claim first. It's not true." But Jesus, so this is what, I'll say this final point. This is what Esau Macaulay writes about in his book, Reading While Black. Yeah, and he talks about the mere fact that the Black church exists in the US or the UK, wherever, is a miracle. He calls it the miracle of the Black church, because there is a history of not believing Black testimony. And but yet there's something that I know as a Black person, there's something about Jesus, and I am drawn to him. And out of that springs the tenacity of the Black church. So I would appeal to the listeners, if your reaction to critical race theory is just to put up a guard and not engage with it and write it off, I would ask you to investigate your presuppositions. Why are you like that? Obviously, the philosophical foundations, some of the areas where critical race theory lands, I do not agree with. I can't, because it's antithetical to the Christian worldview. However, can you engage with anything? Can any of that be redeemed?
And as you're speaking, Claire, there's a few things with the conversation in the past. We've had 3 conversations now about Islam, and the last one particularly was trying to find areas of agreement, talking about who Jesus is, how they view Jesus. Everything about Islam is built antithetical to the Christian faith, but we probably don't respond, and some people do maybe, to this in the same way to Islam as we do to CRT. And I think actually there is a bit of a trend in apologetics channels to be as demeaning to a person's faith without really building a bridge to walk across. And I think there is a time for polemic, but I think we can end up trouncing on what people find sacred before we've actually built trust to engage with them. And I think that's what Paul does well in Acts 17. He doesn't demolish all these ideas, yet in another letter he says we do demolish ideas. So it's how and when is it right to? And I think when we see something that is antithetical to Christ in CRT, we do stand our ground and say, look, this is why I can't go follow you down that road. But when you're talking about redemption, this is what I hear, and yes, I'm all for justice. Yes, I'm all for that, and I just sort of trying to repeat back to you what I'm hearing is that this need for nuance, for engaging well, for listening well, and not just going, everyone's a cultural Marxist who starts talking about justice and race and things like that. I realise we're at an hour and a half, and we haven't talked about the second half of this. We've sort of dropped on it, which generally happens in these conversations. And I think it is something that I'll be interested to touch on just briefly. Maybe have we got the time? Claire, have we got 15 minutes? How long do we have?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
15 minutes
Real
is
good.
cool.
Daniel, all good for 15 minutes? I realise
15 minutes is fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of the other extreme of this with CRT is the Christian nationalism side of things. And we've seen that potentially more in the States, though I think there are some aspects trickling in that I've seen on at least comments online where we've had recently a black clergyman said something about Sir Captain Tom, which is probably wasn't the greatest time to tweet something like that. He took it down. The London diocese has then put out a statement saying he's apologized. We apologize on his behalf. But looking at the thread below it, the comments, I would say, are where we end up with some Christian nationalism of so anti CRT. We've got to stand our ground for what we know is Western and true. and so I guess maybe to go back to our terms, I would define Christian nationalism as this concept of my understanding of Christ's teaching is part of my cultural heritage, to the extent that any change to my cultural surroundings or practice threatens my faith. So in the example, really in your face example is an American example, the flag next to the altar, the American flag next to the altar at the front of a church. And on certain days of the year when they celebrate their military, they go all out and it's flags everywhere, even on top of the cross. And so that would be a visual definition of Christian nationalism. I don't think we have it as extreme in the UK, but I think there are elements that I see culturally where we have put things as part of our gospel which are actually cultural. So the way we do church is very white British in majority churches, or the way we lay our church could be. And I'm trying to define nationalism. It might be that I don't have that many examples of this because I haven't actually found that many, but how would you define it, Dan? I see you wriggling.
Well, I think I have to be careful not to confuse nationalism and patriotism.
Okay, yeah,
so,
definitely.
So, you know, I don't think they're necessary. It's difficult because I think we can make conclusions based on, especially as being Brits looking at the US, who are far more patriotic than Brits are by and large. And so I was speaking to an American friend a couple of days ago, just kind of saying how odd we look at America. Sometimes we just, you know, we love America, and you know, I'm a big believer. And I think that a united, healthy America is important for world stability and things like that. And I want to see America do well. And I think the way we look at the US sometimes, and they're actually, especially Christians as well, they have things intertwined much more closely than we do in terms of love of country, love of their heritage, and their country as it stands, that we don't have an equivalent of. So I just think we have to be careful. I think we can come to we can make assumptions about what we think they're saying, and rather than perhaps what they are. I don't think there's anything wrong with loving your country, thinking that your country is a good country to be. And actually, that's not just what Americans think. You know, where do the majority of the world's immigrants want to go to? What country do they want to go to? United States. They want to go there, and they want to go there because they believe that in the US they will be able to better themselves. Yeah, and they do, and that's why if you look at this is what's interesting. You look at the data between for black immigrants to the US, extremely successful. I think they're probably the highest when it comes to annual earnings and things like that. That immigrants from the Caribbean and West Africa, do fantastic. Like they flourish. It is not accurate. It's accurate to say that they flourish in the United States, and that's why so many people want. That's why so many people want to immigrate there. There's not an assumption from them that it is this sort of. And I'm not saying it's not, but they don't necessarily see it as this racist state that's gonna stop them from flourishing. They see that if they work hard, and I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is what they perceive the perception is. If they work hard, they will succeed. And largely that is often the case. And what it tends.
What's Christian nationalism though? You're going down a bit of a rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, I think I wouldn't agree with your definition. I don't think there's anything. I think that Christians love his country. If you want to look at what academics say, so the most recent book was by Whitehead and Perry, talk about taking America back for God, and they define Christian nationalism in a way that doesn't work for us. So you couldn't have on their definition, you couldn't have Christian nationalism. It have to be defined differently. But they talk about certain criteria that has to be met. So they would look at things like, I think they have I think 6 questions. So one is, and basically depending on where you say whether you strongly disagree or whether you strongly agree, you would depending on what score you got, you would be you wouldn't be a Christian nationalist, or you would. So one of the questions is the federal government should declare the US a Christian nation. So if you strongly agree with that, you're gonna contribute to your score for Christian nationalism. The success of the US is part of God's plan. If you believe that, you're a Christian nationalist. If the federal government should advocate Christian values, if you agree with that, you're a Christian nationalist. The federal government should allow prayer in public schools. If you agree with that, you're a Christian nationalist. And so there's a lot of like for me, that's not very helpful, because I think there are things within that I wouldn't agree with, but there's also parts where I would agree, and on that score I don't come up as a Christian nationalist, but a lot of the fear and stuff that's being stoked up about this group of Christian nationalists who are going to destroy the world. I don't think they're actually a lot of the discourse about that basically seems to be trying to define conservative Christians in a way that they're this boogeyman group, Christian nationalists.
That's interesting. Just before we dig into that, Claire, do you have a particular definition in mind when we talk about because you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I'm just going to comment on there's a comment in the live chat. There is no Christian nationalism. If you follow Christ, you're a Christian. We agree with that, except that there is, or I do, so I won't speak for everyone. I would agree with that, but there is a form of nationalism that I am wary of that comes into the church. And so I'll come back to the difference I see between nationalism and patriotism, because I think there is a difference there. But Claire, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Dan, I just want to pick up on a point you said. This idea of Christian nationalists or Christian conservatives who are seen as the bogeyman, who are going to infiltrate. That is the description. Maybe not in the same words. I think has been labelled indiscriminately upon critical race theory.
So I thought that was interesting.
Race theory is the bogeyman that is going to bring down Christianity in the West. That's what I've seen, which I think is very, very. And you said that you don't think such a bogeyman exists, but I have seen the caricaturing of critical race theory as the worst evil that is going to bring down, that is threatening to bring Christianity, and that is my issue. So for me, Christian nationalism, and people are saying, I've seen in the chat, people are saying that there is no such thing as Christian nationalism. What I mean is that I don't think there should be such a thing as Christian nationalism. I'm trying to describe a phenomenon that I'm seeing in the culture, which is, let's take for instance, is it Jeremiah Johnson, an American Christian minister?
Yeah.
Laid out an apology for prophesying that Trump would have a second term in office. And I'm not even going to get into that, but when I read the apology, I couldn't stomach reading all of it, to be honest with you. But the bits I did read, he kind of laid out, first of all, what he said, and then what happened in reality and why he's apologizing. When I read what he actually said about Trump having a second term, it was so detailed. It was like, I couldn't believe how detailed his vision of his prophetic idea of what Trump would do and achieve in a second term would be. And I thought, if God can speak to you so clearly about what Trump's second term would be, can God not speak to you about, the horrors of racial injustice as well? And so for me, Christian nationalism is this tying together of Christianity with political aims. I have seen videos of so many people, American Christians, who prophesied that Trump would be re-elected. And I'm not here to get into American politics, as in
no, that's fine. Yeah.
Versus Democrats, but I'm talking about using Christianity to state your political aims, and then the apology, which as I said, I didn't read all of it, didn't seem to do justice to what he was saying. But I think perhaps there is slightly more danger in a movement that dresses itself up as Christianity, is in the house, right? Claiming to be Christian, but is actually can lead to some quite dangerous ends. And I think for me, watching that and then seeing the Capitol riots on January 6th and tumbleweed, for the same Christians who would condemn critical race theory as the worst evil against Christianity in the West, not saying too much about, flags saying Jesus 2020, a noose being erected in the middle of the square. I think I saw a video of a guy who's wearing that helmet thing, having a prayer meeting as they broke into the Congress room. In the name of Jesus.
The Viking guy, yeah.
Come on, let's have a conversation about that. Surely to me, that is slightly more dangerous because it's dressed up in all of the garbs of Christianity. And I think we need to have a discussion about that. That's my roundabout way of trying to define what Christian nationalism is.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of American Christians, and this is what I was talking to my friend about, are their politics and their Christianity are enmeshed in a way that they shouldn't be. They're unable to be objective, and I think that the nature of political affiliation there plays a part in that as well, because you have to register. You're a registered Republican, and you can only or you're a registered Democrat. It's very different to the political system here, and so it does end up sort of forming. Being almost identity forming in a way that it wouldn't be in perhaps over here. I think again, one of the differences I think with critical race theory as well, I think where people would see a difference is in terms of their influence. Well, I guess I think both will probably be both be the case for both. There will be some political influence on both cases. I think one of the things that you see is university campuses are places where critical race theory and those I don't mean critical justice in the pejorative sense, but critical justice in that sense have power. And and you see a lot of universities having mandatory training in all students have to have training in white privilege and all these kinds of things. And you see, I think there is a concern about it does have this cultural influence in a way that Christian nationalism doesn't. But I'm concerned about both. I don't think Christians should their politics. I'm a real believer. I'm in just for me, political engagement always requires compromise. And that's why I struggle to vote. I don't think a Christian should ever self-identify as. When Christians start talking about politics more than the gospel, I just have concerns. When I see all Christian, I'm a Christian, they're talking about the Labour Party or Conservative Party, I just think you've lost your way. And I know that's controversial. I just don't think that the means of changing the world is through the gospel and not through trying to wield political power over people you disagree with. And that's something that a lot of American Christians disagree with. And unfortunately, it breeds extremes. And that's why you see America becoming increasingly fractured, because you've got people trying to hit, I want political power so I can push my views on you, not persuade you of them or persuade you through love and reason, but I want to persuade you. I'm going to crush you with my political power, and then when I lose power, now now it's my turn to get back, and I'm going to crush you with my political power. I'm going to force you to embrace your children to have my beliefs, and it's just it's created this toxic environment where Christians are doing things they shouldn't be and saying things they shouldn't be, and I dislike both.
Yeah. I think just to clarify why I went for the flags in the churches. So yeah, I agree. There's a healthy nationalism in some respect. Maybe not nationalism, healthy patriotism. In that you can love your country and be critical of it. And generally, I think if you love your country, you're critical of it, or you should be. Where it falls into nationalism is where you can no longer hear criticism and are ultimately defensive of it because you think it's God's country. And I think there's a massive aspect of that with regards to what I see in church. I get, because I've got a bunch of Christian friends in the States around the voting point. I had friends sharing their friends' sermons or their pastor's sermons, and they were about how to vote, who you should vote for, who you shouldn't vote for, why you can't vote for a Democrat. That was most of them. And then a bunch of pastors, including John MacArthur, saying you can't be a true believer unless you vote for Trump. So that's the kind of, and the reason I'm wary of that is because that then filtered into, and I think the sort of, and it is a Republican aspect in the States, but we don't really need to go down that route, but the QAnon aspect that has jumped on board. So the whole conspiracies and the following that down seems to be a white phenomenon, mostly from the crowds on Capitol Hill. And they are waving these banners that say Jesus saves, and having prayer meetings, and they were apparently saying prayers and worship in the middle of Capitol while they'd stormed in and someone had got shot. So whatever your views on that whole Capitol Hill riot, whether it was Trump supporters or whatever, my frustrations were that became the conversation was among Christians of, they're not us, they're not me as a Trump supporter. And you're like, but that's not the point. They're waving Jesus banners. They're waving Bibles. Surely you want to go, they're not Christians, or they're not the true believers, or whatever. Whatever you want to do to say that's not right. But I've seen videos of pastors now going back to their pastors, back to the churches, saying, yeah, I'll be there again. I was on Capitol Hill and it was great until some people did some silly things. And you're like, that's not that's not, if there's any tables were turned, I think that we'd see a vast difference in how it was. And
that's my issue. I'm not here to say that Christians should embrace critical race theory wholesale and run with it. I'm here to say, what can we engage with? That's what I'm here to say. Because we are, lovers of Christ. We want to share our faith. Okay, that's what I'm saying. I am not saying that everyone who was at Capitol Hill is and behaved in a certain way is representative of all Christians. I'm not saying that. But what I have seen is that there is more of a nuance and a grace given to, they were false teachers, those people who prophesied that Trump was going to have a second, and they were the false Christians. But everyone, a Christian who says, look, okay, racial injustice exists. let's leave critical race. If they just say racial injustice exists in interpersonal and systemic forms, you're a critical race theorist. You need to go back to the Word of God, and then saying actually maybe critical race theory has something that we can learn from. Again, there isn't that nuance, which is just thrown out, and I think that is an issue. I think there isn't there's a disparity in the force and the millennials might say the energy that was brought to Black Christians who were saying racial injustice exists, or people who talk about critical race theory, a huge condemnation of them bringing that to the table, and a very light touch, or we need to have some nuance here, not everyone on Capitol. And I think that's a problem, and it's one we need to ask ourselves why. And I have some of my own reasons as to why I think that is.
Trying to type and respond at the same time is quite difficult. I think you're spot on, Claire. I think it's we say it a lot on this channel. Nuance is required, and I think listening well is vital in all these situations, and also trying to be consistent. And I think just on a sort of final comment, the dangers I'm seeing in all of this, and I saw it a lot around the riots of Capitol Hill, was a preemptive strike of don't you dare condemn this if you didn't condemn the summer riots. And in regards to BLM, that instantly even the people that are against CRT spotted a discrepancy in, or wanted to make it a race thing. And it was a bizarre situation on my Facebook feed, because I've just got different people on my feed seeing people jump on this idea that we're not going to condemn this until you condemn that. It's just a very bizarre idea. And I think on your podcast, Claire, you've got a very good, I think it's one of your first ones on whataboutism. And I think that's a valid thing of, I can condemn this thing without needing to justify X, Y, Z as well as this thing. And trying to get people to explain their different sides without condemning everything about their side, I think is stuff that we're trying to get across in this conversation. I realize the time. Are there any sort of final points going away from this? Any resources that you found clarified? Because I think that's part of it as well. When all of us just at some point have said that there's aspects to CRT that aren't very well defined. Trying to find the redemptive aspects are difficult. And there was a comment in where was it? Someone commented about actually asking directly, is there a repentance or a redemptive aspect? My response on that is just that's the point, is ask that question. What do you, if someone comes to you with CRT, ask the questions, where is the end goal? Where are we headed with that? So I'm going to go to Claire. What resources would you direct people to on this, and any final comments as well?
With regard to kind of seeing what some of the consequence is of just rejecting CRT wholesale and saying, calling anyone who says racial injustice exists as a cultural Marxist, do look at, there's a video series by Lisa Fields of the Jude 3 Project. Okay, the Jude 3 Project. And she's got a series called Why I Don't Go. And she's talking to Black Christian millennials about why they no longer go to church. And I think that would give us something to think about. So I would recommend that resource. And anything written by Vince Bantu and Esau Macaulay, I think they are really articulating well some of the issues that I'm trying to raise here.
Agreed. Esau Macaulay, I've read his book Reading While Black recently, and I highly recommend it. I haven't yet read Vince Bantu, but I look forward to engaging with him. Dan, any resources you've come across that
I will just say first, there was a commenter, what is it, DWB, who mentioned about AI being created by humans by humans with biases. And they're right. Nevertheless, the empirical research, when there have been studies done using AI and looking at recidivism rates for criminals, AI was much more accurate at identifying people who were going to commit crimes rather than the human judges themselves. So that might be the case. They do have some inherent bias within them, but it was much more effective at getting the beneficial outcomes compared to humans pretending that we're able to be objective when we can't. In terms of resources, I'm just going to say I do like Thomas Sowell. I think everyone should read Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell. I think that regardless of whether you stand, I think it is.
We do encourage people reading people they disagree with.
So on both sides, the stuff I'm not quite so sure on. He doesn't always give his sources, whereas other things he does. But it's genuinely interesting read. In terms of critical race theory, just try and read the original sources. I think that's the best way of trying to get your head around. My temptation is always trying to read people who summarize things for me, especially when they're people that I agree with on other things. And so that can be my temptation too. But I think a much fairer way is to try and read what people are actually saying for themselves rather than letting someone else tell you what they're saying. And that's not always the case.
Awesome. Is there anything you'd like to say as we close?
Yeah, I just respond to a comment in the chat. It says, by definition, if you claim that someone asking for evidence for your claims is an insult or discrimination, this is victimhood culture, e.g. Islamophobia, Me Too. Okay, just to be clear, when I was saying that if I'm saying as a Black person, racial injustice exists, and I am bringing empirical data, academic journals, research not done by Black people, I think that data is rational and sufficient, that I'm bringing the evidence and then just not being believed, not listening to, that is a problem. I'm not saying racism exists, we need to sort it out, and bringing nothing. I'm saying there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, a lot of conversations I've had, and this kind of pushback, this instant pushback. I'm not claiming to me, that's not victimhood, because I have done the work to bring the data. But as I have tried to say, for a long time, there has been question marks over Black testimony. And the testimony of Black Christians, I would say, from what I've seen. So that I just wanted to respond to that point. I'm not talking about saying something without bringing evidence. I'm saying bringing evidence as well and having that evidence refuted or said, or said to be irrational or said to be, it doesn't count. That's a problem for me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Cool. I realise there's quite a lot of other comments on there, and Claire, thank you so much for your time, and it's been really interesting. It's been so much to process, and I hope that you've found it helpful, and I've really learned a lot from both your interactions, particularly Dan and Claire, and I appreciate that. And so I'm going to wrap it up there. We're almost at the 2-hour mark, so we've covered a lot of ground.
I'll just say I've added a link in there. I can find the academic literature, but if you there's a Forbes article about recidivism and promise of machine learning.
Cool.
That I've put there from Forbes, which is quite a helpful sort of summary for people. Anyone who's interested in what I didn't go into detail, but
cool. Awesome. There's been quite a few comments. Repent, Dragon. I've seen a lot of your comments. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your comments. We do agree that Christianity is all about love, and we do hope we've shown that and discussed how we can do that better as Christians, finding the bridge and all of that. So On that note, thank you for your time. God
Thank you,
bless
Claire.
you. And thank you, Claire. We'll end it there. See you.